to the continuation of our lectures on Emile Durkheim's elementary forms of the religious life. Again, we're using the old Swain translation, and we're going to begin just walking forward through the book as we go. Okay, so let's see if we can do this. So, the big argument of the book, just to get it right away, is that religion and society are essentially the same thing. Society is essentially a real and symbolic structure, and religion is sort of the imaginary way that society is able, the members of the society are able to comprehend a society, and the way that members of the society make sense of the real forces that are generated by human assemblage. So, yeah, so religion is a mediation between the individual and the symbolic order, between the real of embodied collective life and the symbolic order of language and law. So, you know, okay. Durkheim basically argues that religion is a real social fact. All religions are true. He says that right away. Religion is real. Souls are real things. Spirits are real things. Um, Impersonal forces of a religious kind are real. So okay, so there's a social ontology of religious phenomena, and again, Durkheim's a social realist, and that these things are real in effect. Okay, I'm gonna probably skip through some of this just to get inside the book right away. So, why would a social theorist watching Europe plunge into World War I write a book about primitive religion? So again, like I said in the last lecture, this book isn't really about religion. It's really about society and the forces that, the way that society makes sense of the social forces. So religion is society. Society is religion. They're mirror to each other. At least religion is the mirror. There's no society that hasn't had religion, perhaps no society known to history that was not also religious. On page 245, he has a brief discussion of the cult of reason in the French Revolution, which was a kind of direct, non-transfigured society as an object of a cult. In other words, it was kind of like a removal of the religious middleman and an effort to sort of install society as its own object of worship. Didn't quite last long, but Durkheim thinks it's an important moment of a society that wasn't primarily anchored in religion. Mark Worrell and I wrote a chapter in the book Capital and the Mirror, dealing with Walt Whitman and Hicksite Quakerism, and in many ways, Quakerism comes very close to a religionless society, a society where the social force is directly imagined as such. Not quite, but it gets there. Okay. All right, so let's skip that and let's go on. So, page 15. So Durkheim opens the book then with an emphasis upon, again, the social realism, the sociological realism of religion. All religions are alive and real and true. So just to get that out of the way. Page 16, and throughout, he makes the argument regarding the primitive or elementary phenomena as the key to an analytic task, with the idea being that if something is in a complex stage of development, some of the features or the essential nature is difficult to see, and then if you can study phenomena in a primary or elementary system, you can comprehend it better. There's some specious elements to that argument. We'll leave that aside, but just know that that's his justification for trying to find the most sort of undeveloped, primitive society, not in a pejorative sense, but in a technical sense, right? To use as the basis of his work. Page 22. I could read it, but I probably won't. The categories of understanding, space, time, measure, those kinds of things, are of religious origin, right? Number, cause, substance, again, space, time, personality, even. These are all collective representations, which means that they come to us from society, and they are really a distillation of religion, or kind of a later transformation of religion. Page 29, Durkheim reinforces his basic homo duplex model of the human subject, with the individual Um, uh, that each of us have a sort of individual and a collective self, or an individual consciousness and a collective consciousness, right? And his argument is going to be that the sacred or the religious is going to be the quintessence of the social self, even though it's also going to shape the individual. Okay, so book one then, again, Durkheim always divides his books into three books. Book one are the preliminary questions. Again, if you're a student of religion or anthropology, you might find this section more interesting. But since his basic argument is going to be that religion is the way that societies misrecognize themselves, comprehending the ways that early, social philosophers and early anthropologists, early explorers made sense of religion, is simply really studying the history of an air. So it seems to me that this can be read through very quickly. So Durkheim reviews existing theories of the most elementary form of religion, the most basic element of it, and he negates and cancels on page 39 to 44. The supernatural or mystery as being the essence of religion, he sets that aside. Page 44, the notion of divinity or God is the most essential element, and he brings up Buddhism and which doesn't really emphasize God. There's other religions, like Confucianism. Page 50 is where he introduces the core conceptual distinction between beliefs and rights. He maintains this throughout. So beliefs are made up of collective representations. They're really ideas. They're really, I guess we would call, notions. And rights refer to kind of recipe-like determined modes of action. So it's beliefs, rights, ideas, and action. That these are the two sort of elements of the religious life. All right. Page 52 is where he introduces the core distinction of the sacred and the profane. I'd probably better take a look at that for you. So it's on page 56. So here we go. Let me see. Sacred things are those which the interdictions protect, and isolate profane things to which those interdictions are applied, which must remain at a distance from the first. So religious beliefs are the representations which express the nature of sacred things and the relations which they sustain with each other and with the profane world. So that's it. So that's sort of the essence, is the distinction between the sacred and the profane. So the sacred is a thing set apart. The rights are what set them apart, and then the rights are what dictate the way that a society orients itself to the things set apart, right? So that's the essence of it. It isn't a god, it's not souls and these other things, right? It's there. Okay. He talks about the distinction between magic and religion right after that, and makes the argument, which he does elsewhere, is that in the long run, let's walk through this. So page 53, he notes that anything can be sacred. What makes something sacred is simply setting it apart. And that distinction between the sacred and profane is absolute. It's the master category of society. It's the deepest division in any conceptual system, right? And he says that right and wrong or good and bad are but minor distinctions in comparison to them. This divide between sacred and profane is absolute, and again, it is the bedrock upon which social structure is built. So page 54, the sacred and profane create two entire kingdoms, so the profane world and the sacred world, and we as Homo duplex occupy each. Initiation rites, purification rituals, priestly interdictions or interventions, these kinds of things are necessary when you try to bring the profane and the sacred into contact with each other, right? When one becomes initiated into the sacred, it is at that moment that one is literally born again, right? The social birth of the human individual takes place at the moment of induction into the sacred order, okay? So, and then he makes an argument about asceticism. We'll leave that aside. Page 55, the sacred must not touch the profane. So this is in Freud's great book, Totem and Taboo, which is very consistent with Durkheim here. They pull on the same sources. The great taboo, thou shalt not touch profane things shall not touch the sacred. So that's the great interdiction. So the cult then is a social collectivity that is born and reborn, really brought into existence and sustained in existence by adherence to the rites and the beliefs of the group, otherwise known as a church. Page 57, a conceptual distinction is made between magic and religion, and a whole bunch of stuff about that. The main difference is he argues that religions have priests, magicians have magic has magicians, and the church is really the decisive distinction between the two. Page 60, there is no church of magic. Magician has clients, not a church. One of my favorite books is Marcel Mauss's General Theory of Magic. Mauss was Durkheim's nephew, and and so this is a book that was first published in 1902, and that Durkheim references here, right? So the big idea is that there is no church of magic. Magicians have clients, not a church. And is the argument that's going to proceed throughout here is that religion must precede magic, that magicians play in the field of mana, or the field of religious force that's already created by religion, okay? Read the clan definition, page 62. We may skip some of these readings. This is not the clan definition, this is the summary definition. So page 62, we arrive at the following definition. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them, right? All right, so there we go. All right. Okay, here we are. Okay, page 64. There's a discussion of Tyler's theory of animism, which is basically the reading of primary or primitive religion in which the entire material world is doubled in a world of souls. So the double of all things is the soul, the double of the individual is the soul, the double of a rock is the soul, and so on. And that the dream at night, is our experience of our soul. That's sort of the experiential anchor of the notion of the soul of animism. Durkheim just argues that, look, religion precedes this because you have to have a sort of kingdom of souls already in existence, or religion, before you can have a religion of souls, right? So souls are derived from religion, and religion isn't built up out of the experience of the individual soul. That's his argument, right? Page 89, he talks about naturist religion. We're going to leave that aside for right now. Really, it's page 106 is where he gets to the chapter on Totemism as the elementary religion. This is, Fraser, Morgan, McClellan, Robertson Smith, right? And so Totemism is going to be really the subject matter of the book, okay? So there are three regions or societies that are the primary source of our understanding of totemism. One of them is sort of the North American tribal peoples, Northwest Pacific Coast, with maybe the Kwakiutl being the most important, Boaz's collection in Chicago. The Sioux Plains Indians, the Pueblo, right? So there's one, so it's the North American Indians. The Melanesian and Polynesian people of Mana, there's more there too. And then Australia proper, right? Especially the writings of Spencer and Gillen. He spends a lot of time with them, Strello and others, right? Okay, so page 115, Durkheim focuses upon Australia as the most primitive, again, not in a pejorative sense, in a technical sense, and simple religion is possible to find. It's rooted in the basis of clans, as all totemic systems are. And he argues that, look, compared to the North American case and even some of the Polynesian and Melanesian cases, this is a level of very low material culture. The production of economic values remains very low. Really, it's a world without fixed dwellings, fixed houses, without much in the way of clothing, without much in the way of cooking, without agriculture. So it's a relatively low state. of nature. Excuse me, not of nature, but of culture. Okay, so and that basically ends book one, right? Okay, and he does use the North American peoples, especially at times, to look at totemism in a more developed form. Okay, all right, so that ends book one. So now let's get into book two, the elementary beliefs. Okay, chapter one, totemic beliefs, the totem, and as a name and an emblem. Okay, so basically, what Durkheim argues here, as we've talked about before, is that social life is double, and that the totemic system is sort of the most basic world where that doubling takes place. We have the first life world of profane production and profane individuated activity that isn't particularly governed by adherence to or an aggregate of human beings and an adherence to specific values on a moment to moment basis, even though it is guided by values. So, but that's the first world, and the second world is a calling together of people into a sacred group, into a concentrated aggregate, right? So the totem is the name of the collective representation of the group of people called together as essentially a church, right? In this group. So the clan is the actual group of human beings. The totem is the collective representation that is treated as sacred. Okay? So the real group is the clan, and the totem is the mirror of the group, right? So there are 500 totems in Australia, 500 different, mostly animals, some insects, some plants. A few have sort of natural forces like the wind and things, but really mostly it's animals. So there's 500 different animals that are totemic in Australia, meaning that there's at least 500 clans throughout the tribal peoples. There's different divisions here. Okay, so let's take a look now at the basic. Let's see. Um, yeah, let's take a look at what a totem looks like. Okay, so this is from Spencer, some of Spencer and Gillen's imagery. This is a group of men in a clan who are preparing for a korobori, a kind of ritual feast. So the first life men in the clan are relatively unornamented, right? And it is really only in ritual that the name of the totem, or I should say the emblem, the symbol of the totem, becomes the signifier for each of the men in the clan. Here it's men. Okay? And you literally, the totem is literally written upon the person of the believer, the person in the group, right? So you stop being a profane person engaged in everyday life, and you instead become overwritten. You take on the appearance of your totem. I don't know what this one is. We'll just say it's a black snake or something. I'm not sure what this one is. Again, as Durkheim argues, the exact animal doesn't matter. Here's the emu totem. Again, a man getting ready for aggregation in the totemic society, and so this man has been completely overwritten with emu markings. Again, it's a stylized image of an emu. It's not the actual emu, but again, you don't do your first life activity of hunting and fishing and those kinds of things using wearing this garb. It's only during sacred times. Here's a group of men, again, overriding the collective representation, the totem on the body and even on space, right? So this is, again, preparation for a feast of some kind, and the men are there. So again, it's an emblem. It's the name of the group. It's the emblem. It's the brand of the group, if you want to think of it that way, right? So again, this isn't everyday life. This is a pulling out of the first world of profane activity into the sacred. Here is a group of men ready for a sacred activity. Again, I don't know what exact totem this is. I should have written it down. But again, this is an overriding of the profane with the identification of the sacred. I think, again, this is a snake. I'm almost certain of it for these men in this totem. These are actual images from the Spencer and Gillen collection. Okay, And again, this is from the Northwest coastal Indians. Um, um, but again, like you actually are engaged in imitative rites where you're taking on the appearance and the mannerisms and so on of your totemic source of identification. Okay, and then so that is what occurs during. So that's what a totem is. So people have a double life, homo duplex, the world of profane existence in which the clans and totems mix, and then a pulling aside, a setting aside, a separation into the totemic groups. Second, okay, all right. There are three routes into a clan, three ways to be recruited into one, three ways in which people are sorted into clans. First is through maternal totems, where the totem of the mother becomes the totem of the child. Two paternal totems, where the totem of the father becomes the totem of the child. And then there's a whole bunch of haphazard or ritualistic ways in which totems are assigned to children. One of them is that wherever the woman happened to be walking at the time of quickening, when she first realized she was pregnant, that location often is marked by a particular totem, and then that becomes the totem of the child. Okay, so totem so there's two basic rules of totem. This is consistent with Freud. You perform positive rites to ensure the totem is reproducing. And then two, you abstain from marriage and sex and diet and touch and other things with things that are contaminated with the sacredness of the totem. Okay, so these are negative rites, is the abstentions. Don't touch, don't do things, don't, right? And then the positive rites are where, again, you're feeding and taking care of the totem in some way to make sure it reproduces. So in some way, when you're in a totem, your well-being and the well-being of the class of animals that is your totemic source of identification is linked together. So many of the rites are about taking care of the totem. Okay, and again, first world activity is diffuse, second world concentrated in the totem. Okay. Um, the totem is a collective representation, all right? It is a name, a symbol, an emblem, not an individual, right? So it isn't Donald Duck, right, or Daffy Duck, or Scrooge McDuck, who is identified by name as an individual that is our totemic source of identification. It is the entire species. And it's really not even the species, it's the idea or the concept associated with the species, the concept of the totem that is actually shared by both the species and the clan. They believe themselves to be sort of um, shared offspring of this totemic principle. Okay, so 136, the totem is overwritten upon collective objects and upon people upon entrance into sacred space and time. And even use that to generate something on the order of a sacred order in space. Page 137, the totem is often tattooed, scarified, painted upon people. Costuming that represents the totem species, these kinds of things. We just showed that. Page 138 and 9, the division of time in totemic societies. This is really crucial again. So the two phases of life, the two kingdoms of life between ordinary profane time and sacred totemic time. Okay, so profane time, first life, and second life. I borrow here some of the language from Mikhail Bakhtin, but it works here. Again, first world or ordinary time, profane, economic, physical, routine and individual, and then sacred time, sacred life, religious, political, feasting, festival. So, in many societies, up to 1/3 of time, about 1/3 of time, is actually sacred time. In the, let's see if I can do this, the ritual cycle of the Catholic Church, there's a half of the year that is sacred and a half of the year that is profane. In other words, the feasts of the Roman Catholic Christian calendar all begin here. I think. Okay, you have the feast of Christ the King, which takes place right before Advent. And then right after Advent, you have Christmastide. And then right after Christmastide, Yeah, you usually drop into ordinary time for a little while, and then you have Lent. Then after Lent, you have Eastertide, and then after Eastertide, you drop back into ordinary time with maybe a few intercessions afterwards, right? Um, yeah. So basically, the time period from say November, 15th through say April 15th is it's winter. It's a time when people are consolidated together, aggregated together more, with often without field work to do and those kinds of things. And so in Western Europe, that period of time from November 15 to April 15 is sort of the sacred half of the calendar, and the ordinary time is over here during the time of planting and work and harvest and those kinds of things. And again, there's ordinary time intermixed here as well, and there's a few feasts intermixed here too, right? Like Halloween and that kind of thing. But by and large, there's a concentration in a particular time period of the sacred versus the profane. Okay, now in many of the tribal peoples, there's the same kind of thing. There are going to be times when the first world activity of profane production is going to dominate, and then other times when the sacred time is going to dominate. Now remember, both phases are going to be essential to social life. It is during sacred time that the overriding occurs, when it's mandatory to take on the emblematic symbols of the totem. Page 140, the totem is the very type of the sacred thing. It's the ultimate sacred thing. So again, it's an imaginary thing. We can imagine what, say, an emu is, or we can imagine what a witchetty grub is, or a carpet snake. We can imagine these things, all of which are totemic animals here. We can imagine it, and that provides fixity to the notion of the sacred and to the identification that we have. Okay? But it's the idea, not the actual species, that matters. Okay. All right, then there's the discussion of the Charinga, which is the ultimate storage battery of the sacred and of effervescence in the group. So I've got here just a little photocopy of a Charinga. So a Charinga is a piece of wood, usually, that has been rubbed, and then etched upon it is the outline of the totemic markings. Okay, I don't know what these are. Again, I should know, and I don't. But this is the kind of stylized representation of a totem. So whether this is a grass snake or an emu or a witchetty grub, I don't know which one it is, but that's as stylized as it is, right? It looks like very abstract art. This is the mark of the totem. So it isn't like a child's picture of an emu or something like that. It's this stylized image. So the Charinga is the mark of the totem that is brought out in totemic ceremonies. So it's a distillation, a kind of concentration of the totemic substance. Page 141, at initiations, neophytes are often given a secret Charinga name, it's called. It's a name that's associated with the carrier of the sacred principle. The profane must not see, touch, or come into contact with the Charinga, so women often can't touch them if they're considered profane. Little kids can't touch it, and those kinds of things, right? Okay, all right. So page 142, there's a contagious quality of sacredness. It transfers from the Charinga as the most, again, think of it as the storage battery that's just radiating power. And the sacredness radiates off into, in a contagious way, to the place where it's stored, to the people who touch it, and so on, right? So there's a contagious quality of sacredness, right? So no profane thing can come into contact with it. There's a magic power associated with the Charinga. It's used for healing. It's used in warfare. It can control climate, wind, and rain, and those kinds of things. The Charinga then is the sacred ark, a Judaic reference here of the clan. The Charinga is cared for like a person. Yeah, so you're taking out. It's stroked. It's polished. It's fed. It's bled upon. Right. So there's all kinds of care and concern that showed to the Charinga. It's treated as a person. So this sacred totemic principle that's sort of born by the Charinga is taken care of by the group of people who associate with the cult. Page 147, the Charinga is sacred. It's like a magic circle. It's like an altar. It's an emblem, a symbol, a collective representation of the group itself. Okay. Chapter 2, the totemic animal and humans, right? So the totem always carries a taboo. You're forbidden to touch it, to eat it, to kill it. You can't do it. At least most of the year, you're not able to, like on page 150. There are exceptions, though. Very old men who themselves are relatively sacred, and moments of when the totem gathers during particular ritual feasts are times when the totem can be eaten. But you have to become sacred yourself, in essence, in order to endure such a normally profane thing. So there are all kinds of prohibitions regarding the totemic species. Page 156 is crucial. That it's not the species, not a specific animal, but again, it's the whole collective representation. It's the notion of the totem that's sacred, right? Sacredness then is symbolic. Can I emphasize this? So in Jacques Lacan's triadic view of the subject and society, right? The three orders are the real of sort of pulsations and physicality and so on. Um, the symbolic world of language and law, the wispy thin but nevertheless determinate conceptual and symbolic structure, and then the imaginary is everything in between that can be pictured, tasted, touched, and so on. So the sacredness is a principle. It is symbolic, right? It results from rites and beliefs that set something apart, and it isn't really imaginary in form. You use the imaginary of the totem and of the Charinga, right? And of the costuming and so on as a way to imagine the sacred principle, but the sacred principle is itself intangible and symbolic. Okay, page 157, Homo duplex is talked about again. For in a totem world, a person is two beings that coexist at the same time. Page 157, you're both human and animal. And oddly enough, here animal is social, right? So you're an individual or singular human being that has, hunger and gets ill and those kinds of things. And then you're also a social collective human being that's associated with your totem annual. So you're doubled, right? So the totem is the mythological misrecognition of the social membership of your group, right? The social nature of the self is imagined to be an animal. So it's the strangest thing. People in a totem are in a group, but they imagine that they're actually in an animal, right? So the totem is mythological misrecognition. Okay, belief that the clan, the actual group that's gathered together to worship the totem, has a sacred and deep tie to the totem annual. Sacredness is from this shared ancestry. Page 159, blood. It's all about like blood, the blood relationship. Blood is often considered sacred or taboo, either one. In Marx's writings, value is the coagulated blood is sort of a representation of coagulated human labor. So blood, value, honor, it often follows from blood. So there's a lot here about blood being used in totemic rituals to give value, to give honor to totemic things. You bleed on it, right? So again, the Charinga gets bled upon, ground with the mark of the totem gets bled upon, and so on, okay? So religious dignity is at its highest among old men. Men have more dignity than women, the old over the young, the uninitiated have the least. Okay, so chapter 3, the cosmological system and the totem, the idea of class. Okay, so it's in this chapter, again, where I think Durkheim spends, to me, too much time, where he's trying to make the basic argument that the structure of totemic beliefs is going to be a mirror of the structure of social divisions within society itself. So that if you're in a relatively simple society, you're going to have a relatively simple set of classifications at the level of the totem. And if you're in a really complex society, you're going to have like a hierarchy of different sacred beings, gods, demons, and so on. Okay? There are three sacred classes in totemic societies. It's the totemic emblem, which is symbolic. The animal and plant of the totem, which is imaginary, it can be seen, tasted, and touched. And number 3, it's the members of the clan and the totem. And this is going to be the real basis of the totem itself, right? The force of the totem comes from the members of the clan that are gathered together. Page 169. So keep this in mind, right? The totem itself is actually a symbol, but the imaginary form is the plant and the animal. and the members of the total or the totem, the members of the clan that's held together by the totem. That's the real basis of the thing. Okay, page 169. The structure of the actual social organization determines the structure of thought. So the whole system of totemic beliefs is a mirror of society. So again, that's the big argument here, the social construction of knowledge. The structure of the world determines the structure of thought. There's going to be a congruence. Page 172 to 173, the structure of society determines not the content of the specific totemic classes, but the structure of the categories of understanding. Okay? So again, it's not the content, it's the structure. That's one of my mantras when I'm teaching my classical social theory classes. It's not the content, it's the structure. It's really arbitrary which animal is chosen, but what matters is that it's set apart and that there's a structure of negative rights and positive rights that relate the clan to it, right? So the initial content of the actual species is arbitrary, but the system of beliefs and rights that develops mirrors and reflects the social organization. Page 175, it says to read it, I won't, but it says society itself is sacred. The image and the symbol of society is here, the totem. So it's the society itself that is the sacred, it's the source of the sacred, it's the experience of the sacred, but it's imagined here in the form of the totem. Page 179, the classification system metastasizes beyond the three classes and winds up consuming all of life. Page 180, the totem is the religion then of the clan, but there's always more than one totem, right? So in this section, he makes the argument that wherever you have a clan and a totem, you have to have multiple clans, which means you have to have essentially a tribal structure. So totemism isn't a clan religion, it's actually a system of religion that's associated with the tribe. So totemism is tribalism, actually, okay? And so that's why you get all those complicated interrelationships between things that are in the totem and associated with totems, so that different groups of people are drawn apart and are oriented towards different sacred things, but are nevertheless all part of one system that co-recognizes each other's sacred principle, the tribe. So chapter 4 is about the individual totem and the sexual totem. So if you have two totems, you have the collective totem that represents the entire clan. There's also tribal individual totems. So your surname would be equivalent to the collective totem of all the members of your clan. But then again, during your initiation, you're going to get an individual totem name, right? Which is your alter ego, your double, your guardian ancestor. I was talking to my wife. We were raised Roman Catholic in rural South Dakota. We were both taught that we should believe in and even pray to our guardian angel. It has kind of the same quality about it, kind of an individuated protector. Page 188, this is the big art, I won't read, but that the collective totem precedes the individual totem. Again, this is one of Durkheim's main arguments. The collective always precedes everything else. So you have an individual soul that comes from the kingdom of souls as created in the collective. If you have an individual totem, that's your individual animal of identification or something, that's going to come from the already existing system of totems within the group. So the collective totem precedes the individual. Page 191, rituals and rites determine your personal totem, and that can vary in a whole bunch of ways. All right, and then in between the collective totem and the individual totem can be intermediate ones, like the sexual totem, like all men and all women are part of another totem. And his argument is that that's going to be a kind of marker of a tribal totem, a tribal totemism that has been sort of in either decay or development in some way. So it's a remnant left behind. Page 206, so you get the collective totem first, then these individual or particularized forms. Page 214, there's a long paragraph introducing the concept of mana or a wakan. So again, this is going to be really important in our next section, so why don't we just skip to that. So when I teach this book, I often have students begin their reading right here at chapter 6 in book 2. The notion of the totemic principle, mana, and the idea of force, okay? Or the nature of the totemic principle, mana, and the idea of force. Okay, page 216. So the sacred, again, remember there's three classes of things that are sacred. a symbolic, an imaginary, and a real sacred. The symbolic sacred is the symbol of the totem. The imaginary sacred is the species or animal that represents the totem. And then the real sacred thing is the member of the clan that gathers together to honor and worship the totem. And then separate from that is the world of the profane, the entire other kingdom of the profane. On page 217, there's a quote about mana. That mana is, I think it's Polynesian, I think, Melanesian, I can't quite remember, but it's the it's a it's a name among certain totemic peoples for the undifferentiated, indistinct, impersonal force that underlies the rest of the sacred world. All right? And Durkheim wants us to hold on to this idea. He argues that when people are aggregated together, they generate a real force. Societies generate a real force. Aggregates of human beings generate a real force. And when they're close together, when they're agitated, and when they're focused, they generate more. And that force is real. It's really felt. It has real effects, right? And then it gets projected onto an imaginary thing called a totem here, right? But before there's the projection onto the thing, some societies had a word to recognize the sacred force itself, the principle, the undifferentiated force, and that's mana, or wakan, or orenda, right? So these are words like the Sioux word wakan, that a term for basically just that the sacred principle that is felt when the group is together, and that permeates the universe from there. Okay, so mana then refers to the undifferentiated force of the sacred in totemism. Okay, page 217. Again, I won't go into a lot of detail here, but in my classes I like to draw attention to the way that Durkheim and Marx are very similar to each other. That Marx on commodities and Durkheim on mana are very similar. This was developed by David Smith at the University of Kansas, and I think his doctoral dissertation, and then in really much of his teaching and writing. And then sociologist Mark Worrell also makes similar claims as well. That there's a congruence between the wakan, which is this basic, or mana, this basic undifferentiated social surplus that's generated by people in aggregate, right? And that can take very specific form, like a specific totem or a specific spirit or demon or something else, right? And that's the world of social values. And then Marx writes about how social jelly or congealed labor value, right, is this undifferentiated, impersonal force, right, or resultant of force that then gets embodied by or borne by different commodities. So the form of economic value is commodities, the form of social values, totems, sacred beings, and so on, right? Okay, so I won't go into that any further, but this is a really interesting line of work. Mark Worrell, David Smith, my own work actually, on the values distinction is really rooted in the same problematic, the Marx-Durkheim overlap. Page 218. So the force of mana in totemism is the real force that's generated by the actual clan, and the effects then are really felt, right? So the social collective is the source of the energy whose effects are felt. He then goes on, it's a weird thing that even though the force has power to compel obedience, we nevertheless, in a moral system, have an obligation to obey. We have an obligation to obey the thing that would dominate it if we don't. So again, there's kind of like a doubling here, right? It must be obeyed, but nevertheless, yeah, it will impose itself upon us, but we nevertheless have to obey it. Okay, page 224. The principle of mana is found everywhere, and hence, because wherever you have a group, it generates this force. Page 225. Durkheim. So mana then is the single and universal marker of tribal society above individual clans. So that each totemic group is actually a chapel of the tribal church. Yeah. So the entire tribe then is the system of social aggregations that generates mana, and that these then get born by or fixed upon in imaginary form upon specific totems. So totemism is a local chapel, a particularized chapel of the tribal church. I just love that. Uh, yeah. So page 226, Totemism is a federation religion. So the structure of a tribe is always a federation of clans, and so too is Totemism, a federation of totems. Page 227, magic plays with mana, the stuff that is already generated by religion. So the magician often is outside of the clan or the totem order. They're not particularized, they're not affixed within the totem and the clan. And so, again, the magician that has a kind of reservoir of universal mana to play with often can't just be fixed within a specific totem, but will float betwixt and between clans. So it's almost like you have to have a tribal level of organization to generate this free-floating mana that's available for a really highly developed magic life. Okay? Again, magicians don't have a church, they have clients, and they lack that particularity of being affixed to a specific totem. Page 228. Yeah, this is the Dakota account of the particularization of wakan. I just love this section. My friend Mark Worrell likes to reference this. It's this idea that the sacred comes and goes. So the wakan is out there everywhere, but it comes and goes, and where it touches down, it gets particularized into a specific totem or a specific being or a specific sacred site, right? So that wakan is that principle that's everywhere from this group that comes together and generates it, and then it gets particularized wherever it comes and goes, touches down, right? So page 229, I'm supposed to read at the triple X, I probably won't. It's a section about, indefinite powers, impersonal forces as the essence of religion. So it isn't spirits, it isn't personifications, it isn't animals that is the essential force at play in religion. It's actually mana or wakan. It's that social force that's generated in the real by a group of people, and that's imagined to be something that comes from the sacred order. Page 234. This real, then, this symbolic real force, right? Because it's both symbolic and real, is religious. Then it is the origin of religion, and it's religion and structure, So that notion of force, then, which begins in religion, eventually jumps over into philosophy and science as you get development of society. I think I'm going to stop here before we move on to the next section.